Joining us today, we're going to be tying the Tungsten 20-incher stone. This is a variation of the classic 20-incher stone with a extra small gold tungsten bead. What we've got here on the vise, along with that extra small gold tungsten cone bead, is a size 12 200R Tiemco hook. We've also got about 10 wraps of 0.20 lead-free underwire. This is a heavy pattern. It gets down quick. Stoneflies typically they're dredged along the bottom. That's where they live. It's a great dropper pattern as well, especially under something buoyant like an Amy's ant. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Material-wise, we will be tying with Tiemco UTC 140 denier and black. I like to use 140 here because it helps build up the taper a little more quickly. You can also use a dubbing if you'd like with a smaller thread, which is what a lot of guys do. So we'll go ahead and tie on the thread here. Snip it off. We're just going to take this thread to the back. Right to that barb point. We're going to give our thread a little counterclockwise turn, tighten it up, and we're going to build a small little thread bump to separate the tails we're about to tie on, which will be brown goose biots. This doesn't need to be big, just big enough to keep them split. So with goose biots, there's a couple different ways to do it. Some people tie in 2 at a time, some do 1. I go back and forth. We'll go 1 at a time today. So lengthwise on these, we're looking at about a hook gap is the typical point I use for length. You want these to be pretty short. So we'll secure this with 3 wraps. Take a look at the length, a little bit longer than I want. So I'll just slide it back. That's about right. We want a slight upward degree on these tails, so make sure you're careful with that as you wrap back to secure it. We'll take this back to the lead-free wire. Then we'll come back forward to tie our next one in. Easy to match the length once you've got the first one in. I like to rotate my vise here and tie it in where it's just kind of laying on its slide. These things will slip on you a little bit. A little longer than I want. That's about right. Make sure we have a little upward. And we'll just take this on back. That lead underwire. From here, we'll just trim these off close. The next thing we're going to do is tie in our ribbing material. What we're going to be using today for that is some tan super floss right here. There's a few different variations you can use for this ribbing material. I like the tan super floss because one piece is pretty perfect for the diameter I'm looking at on these for the ribbing. So we'll just take this all the way back, right to those tails, wrap forward. And the next thing we're going to do is tie in our abdomen material, which will be peacock eye sticks. Don't use that cheap strung peacock curl. It really makes a big difference, especially on abdomens that use peacock curl like this or a prince nymph. It goes a long way. So with the size 12, we're going to go with about, let's say 5 pretty fluffy peacock strands. We're going to align the tips here, and we're going to tie this in by the tips, and this will help with our taper. So we've got these nice and aligned. Now we're just going to trim them so that they're flush. Tie these in on the near side, just like we did with the ribbing. Take it all the way back. And from here we can build up a small taper. You know, stones are pretty lean. I'm not trying to make this thing any, you know, super drastic, because what we will do later with the thorax will build that up. But we will create a slight taper here, just with our thread, unless you decided that you wanted to use dubbing, totally fine too. And so from here, we're gonna wrap our peacock curl forward. Couple tricks here. So first wrap, just straight up and down. The next two, we're gonna make diagonally, and this is gonna help taper the body. One wrap right on top of the other. Our third is gonna come straight up and down. And then each wrap after that, straight up and down, just right on top of the last. And that's gonna help build up a fluffier midsection of this fly, which is what we're looking for. We're gonna take this all the way up to the very front, where we'll capture it. With a bunch of strands of peacock curl like this, I like to capture it with 3 wraps in front and 2 wraps behind. If you've ever had your peacock curl come unraveled when you've gotten this far into a fly, it's pretty frustrating. We'll just trim that off close. You can also just rip those off if you want. So after that, we are going to wrap our ribbing. We are going to counter wrap this, so we're going to take it the opposite direction that we wrapped the peacock curl. That really helps to build with the durability here. So in terms of our wraps, we're looking for even wraps that are about equal distance. You can use a landmark of about the width of that super floss. So we've taken it all the way up. I'm going to capture this. Trim it off close. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to tie in our wing case. This is mottled Ozark turkey tail. What we're looking at here is for it to be about the width of the hook gap. We're going to tie this in by the tips. So I've snipped a piece off. Make sure these are nice and lined up. Trim the tips. And we want to tie it in with that dull side facing down, so that the shinier side of the feather is what we see on top. Now it's a little tricky to tie in turkey tail to get the look we're going for. Taking the thread back to, let's say the 65% point. Your first wrap with this stuff, and you want to lay it right on top, should be a loose wrap. If it's not, it's all going to just crinkle together, and then you're going to have this really thin wing case. That's not what we're going for here. And so once you've secured that loose wrap, we don't really want to go further back than the 50% point. I'm a little far back from where I want to be, so I'll retie this in. So loose, and then we'll secure it with a few more wraps. Still a little far back. Sorry, guys. Okay, so we've taken that back to, almost the 50% point there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to put a small dubbing base. We're using natural squirrel dubbing. It's got some nice texture to it that helps imitate stonefly legs, especially when you brush it out a little bit. So you'll have to dub this a few times. But the first thing we're doing is just putting down a small base. And the reason we're doing that first instead of fully dubbing it is we're going to tie in the legs and then finish our dubbing. With the thorax here, we're looking proportion-wise to get it about 1.5 times the rest of the body. So, you know, don't overdub before you tie these legs in. Now for the legs, we are just using some grizzly barred rubber legs. This is tan grizzly barred, white's fine. You know, you can play around there with what you like. What we're gonna do is just snip one piece, cut it in half. We'll tie it in on the near side, and we're tying these in directly on the side, right in the middle, securing it with 2 wraps. Now we'll tie in the far side. We don't want to tie these in too far forward, or else you'll find that they flare straight out to the side instead of going forward over the top of your fly like we want. So now that those are tied in, we're going to finish our dubbing, and this is where we're looking for that, you know, 1.5 times the size of the body for our thorax. You'll have to redub a few times here. Go back behind these legs, clean up our work a little bit that we just did. Better to underdub and have to add some as you go forward than overdub. We're going to dub a little bit right in front of these front legs. And that's about the width we're looking for. I'm going to clean it up a little bit. There's some, it's a little bit chunky, so come back here, clean this up some. Yeah, this doesn't have to be perfect. It's but that's about what we're looking for there. If you can see, it's about 1.5 times the body. So now we're just going to pull this turkey tail over. We're going to secure it with a couple wraps. Once again, when you're doing this, you're going to want to take a loose wrap to start. That way it doesn't get all bunched in together and you've got a nice, you know, wide wing case about the width of that hook gap we're looking for. I typically secure this with about 3 wraps because this stuff does like to come undone on you. And I like to give it 1 wrap in front. We'll cut this out close. All right, so the last thing we're gonna do here is first we're gonna whip finish. Just a quick 4 or 5 turn whip finish. It's a little finicky going in front of these legs, but you'll get it. It's where a small whip finisher like this TMCO whip finisher really comes in handy. It's pretty much all I use anymore, regardless of the fly. All right, got a nice whip finish. Pull our thread back, make sure it's locked into place. Whip finish doesn't come undone. Snip this nice and close. And to finish, we are going to UV the wing case. We're using Solarez Thin Hard UV resin. It's the only UV I use anymore. It definitely holds up the best, dries the quickest. Other UVs start to deteriorate in the water. Not this one. It really holds up well. Really important tip here when you are UVing this wing case is to start with a very small amount, or else it'll seep right through those turkey tails, and it just will not look good. And why tie a fly that doesn't look good? So there's a very small layer. I'm going to cure it. And from there, we'll apply some more and build this thing up. I like to build it up pretty slowly, especially with the first few layers, just to make sure it's not seeping through that wing case a lot. And then I'll start applying a little bit more. Build this up, get the nice teardrop shape we like. And this stuff dries so fast. That's about right. So one more, cure it one more time. We're not going crazy with the UV on there. Just a nice little teardrop on top. Last thing we're gonna do here is cut the legs. We want these to be about the length of the hook shank. So for my back legs, I usually take it right to the hook bend. You can also pull all four up and cut them together to get exact same length legs, but I don't really do that very often. And that's all there is to it. You can get under there with a little dubbing brush and pick it out. That'll give it some nice buggy characteristic to mimic those legs. Pretty simple fly, not expensive materials. One of the most effective freestone stonefly imitations there is. Heavy, gets down quick. Tie this thing up in a variety of different sizes and variations, from the classic to this rubber leg tungsten cone head variation. Enjoy, happy tying. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.